Hi everyone, Stephen here at Teach Me Music, and today we're going to be talking about the different types of basses or different types of bass guitars. And hopefully you already know the anatomy of the bass guitar, and if you don't, go check that out because some of the differences I'm going to be using fancy words to explain, and those fancy words are in that video. So make sure you've seen that, otherwise I'm just talking gibberish, and that's never a good thing. So what are the different types of basses you can get? Well, there's actually quite a lot, and they're very, very subtle in difference. So let's talk about the main difference that most people know about. Well, you can get a 4-string bass, you can get a 5-string bass, you can get a 6-string bass, you can also get 7, 8, and I'm pretty sure somewhere on the planet someone has designed a 9-string bass. But 4 is the most common, so this Ibanez SR1300 right here, this is a common configuration of bass because it's 4 strings. I'm going to show you what a 5-string bass and a 6-string bass looks like very, very shortly, just so you can see the most common. You can get 7, but obviously once you know the difference between 4, 5 and 6, it's not really difficult to notice the difference between 7, let's be honest. Let's start talking about the other differences on some of the basses before I start switching and basically showing you some of the other cool stuff we've got. So the main difference is the pickups. And the pickups, as we've already mentioned in the other video, which is why you should go check it out, is basically that they're magnets. But you can get different types of magnets and different styles. So these ones right here, these are in what we call a humbucker configuration or in a soap bar configuration. And a soap bar basically means that it's a massive, big kind of plastic like holder or container for the magnet. So that is a very, very big magnet, and obviously there's 2 of them. They are what we call single coil magnets though, and a single coil magnet is where we have a single coil around each magnet of the pickup, hence the term single coil. They sound very vintage, very, very warm, and they give you what most people would consider the Fender sound, because Fender were the first people to have single coil pickups because that's just where it kind of came from and they were the first on the market. So single coil pickups have a certain sound and you should get used to hearing that. The other type of pickup that you can get is either a precision bass pickup, which we call a P bass, or a humbucker. They basically have the same difference, but they're just different names. So a humbucker is what we call a dual core pickup, and basically what that means is there's 2 coils around each magnet of the pickup, which means it's a lot louder, it's a lot brighter, and it sounds more modern. And it's because the more you wrap around the magnet, the more output and the more signal you're giving it, which means they're really, really loud, very bright, and sound a lot more modern. So they sound more like poppy, more rocky, more metal. And then your single coil is what you would normally hear in funk, soul, disco, and jazz. You can obviously use anything that you like in any styles of music. I'm just giving you kind of the industry standard definitions so you can hear the difference. And then if you see someone playing a humbucker in a jazz song, you can be like, that's cool, fair enough, nothing wrong with that. And you know what the difference is. So obviously it's all internal, but you can actually tell from the size of the magnets. So these are pretty big, which is why they're called a soap bar. I'm going to show you a 5-string bass in a moment, which has a typical single coil configuration, and you'll see that the magnets are like half the size, and it's a lot easier to notice than you probably think. So one other thing we're going to talk about before I start switching the basses over is we're going to start talking about the difference between passive and active. So passive basses are basses that run without a battery or an external source. And that gives you a slightly warmer, more vintage, and a lower output because there's no battery, there's no internal connection being supplied basically to the electronics. And that's the reason why the battery is there. An active bass has a battery in it, and because it's got a battery, it means that it gives you a brighter, what we call hotter, which basically just means louder, signal from your bass, and it also slightly changes the color. And what I mean by the color is the tone of the bass guitar. So you'll hear the difference between passive and active. You'll prefer one or the other, but you know what the difference is. So passive has a slightly warmer, slightly more vintage sound, and active bass has a slightly more defined, slightly more clarity, a hotter or brighter signal, and it's slightly louder. Exactly like the pickups. So really, really common kind of things. You start to notice common trends, and it's really easy to pick up once you know what you're looking for. So if I flip this bass round, you will see that there is a battery component right here. So as soon as there's a battery component in your bass, it is an active bass. Some basses can be passive and active, which is why we have the switches. So if your bass has switches, chances are it might be passive and active. If you have a battery with no switch, then it's an active bass, or 100% it's active. And then if you don't have a battery, it's passive. Really, really dead simple. Any beginner or anyone that's never played bass guitar can notice the difference. And then as you start to get a little bit more educated, and obviously I'll take you literally step by step through it all in other videos, you'll start to notice the difference in tone, the difference in sound, and it's just really, really good to know. And then you can pick your ideal bass when it comes to buying a new one. So this was a 4-string Ibanez SR1300. This is a passive and an active bass, and these pickups are in a soap bar configuration, but they're single coil pickups. I'm now going to show you a 5-string bass and show you what's on that one. So this is a 5-string bass. Let's count it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So totally a 5-string bass. You can also check out the headstock. Obviously it's got 5 tuning pegs, so it's got to have 5 strings. So obviously, what is the difference between a 4-string and a 5-string? Well, usually it is the lower string. So this string closest to me is a lot thicker, which means I can get a lower sounding note. And that's the reason why most people buy a 5-string, because you can get a lower sounding bass, pretty much. So let's talk about the other differences. Well, if I flip it round, and I need to look because I don't know where it is. Haha. So here are the 2 battery components. So this is an active bass, and it actually has 2 batteries. So just because it has more than one doesn't mean anything else. It just means it's got a bigger supply of source in terms of power. 2 batteries, that's more power than 1. So this is an active bass, and if I flip it back around again, these are your typical single coil pickups. Can you see that the actual plastic container and the holder, can you see that this is a lot thinner than the other bass? If you can't remember what the other bass looked like, pause, rewind, check it out. That is a lot smaller, but these are single coil pickups still. So still a single coil around each magnet, and they're just slightly thinner. This is your typical jazz bass configuration. If you've ever heard the term jazz bass, that's what this is. So that is a 5-string jazz bass, which is active, and obviously those are the subtle differences, as well as obviously how it sounds and looks different. So if you were playing this bass, you would notice it sounds slightly different to the one that I showed you earlier, but I'm just explaining the differences, and in later videos we'll actually hear the difference. So that's a 5-string bass. Let's have a look at a 6-string bass. So you may have noticed I now have a different bass. It's like magic. This is a 6-string bass. So let's count it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So what is the difference between a 6-string bass and a 5-string bass? Well, we still have the lower string, the one that we added on when we picked up the 5-string, but we've also added on a higher string. So this string right at the bottom, this is the additional string of a 6-string bass. So obviously, if we check the headstock, you will see 6 tuning pegs. So we know straight away it's a 6-string bass. Well, what else is like different to this bass? Well, if I flip it round, it's still active. It's still got a battery component. So all of the basses that I've shown you today are active, and then some of them are passive. The first bass that I showed you, which was the Ibanez SR1300, you can go back and check it out. That is a passive and active. This Ibanez, which is an SR306, this is just purely active, which means if the battery dies or there's no battery in there, you get 0 sound because it needs the battery to power the signal. So if I flip it back around again, these pickups right here, they're really big, but can you see that you've got two strips of magnets? This is a typical humbucker pickup because we have two sets of wires, two sets of coils wrapped around each magnet. So they're looking pretty big, but they actually are typical humbucker pickups, which means this is going to be slightly louder, slightly brighter, slightly more modern than the other two basses that you've seen. And it's all about the visual representation at the minute. We will start to hear the difference in other videos, but it's just so the bass that you have right now, which could be anything, it's just making sure that you know what that bass is and you know what you're looking for if you were to go and buy a new bass in the future. So let's talk about 3 different types of basses, and then we're all good. You should be able to rock and roll and start playing bass. So what do I mean about 3 different types of basses? So in my opinion, there are 3 different categories of basses. One is an entry-level bass. The other one is your industry standard or professional bass. And then the third one is a custom-made bespoke bass guitar that you have molded and created to your specification. So entry-level basses are things like Harley Benton, Vintage, Squier. Your industry standard professional basses are things that you probably already know the names of: Fender, Ibanez, Gibson. And then your custom brands are where you go to a luthier, who is someone that makes bass guitars, and you tell him what you want your specification to be. So that could be Alembic, that could be Dingwall, that could also be high-end Ibanez as well. So some companies can actually do all 3. So it's just so you're aware of that there are tiers to a bass. And the entry-level ones are kind of affordable and cheap, but still good. They're still absolutely fine. So if you've got one, don't feel like you need to throw it through the window and basically go buy a new one. That's cool. They're good to learn on and they're good to play. Your industry standard professional basses, they're what you see on most bass players, on most TVs, on most bands, and they're really, really cool, but still affordable. They're just a little bit more expensive. And then your custom brands and your custom basses are when you start forking out kind of like $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 for a plank of wood, which some of us might go, oh my God, why? But if you've got to that level and you're that professional, then having a custom bass is pretty epic, and you're willing to pay the price because it's actually pretty cool. So what you should do is have a look at your bass at home, work out what you've got, work out what you like the sound of as you get more experienced with it, and then when you go and buy a new bass or when you try a bass out, you know exactly what you're looking for because you like that certain sound. So that is all the different types of basses. Definitely go check out what you've got, and when you're ready, we'll see you again next time.